A 17-year-old Utah girl gunned down on her drive home, shot 12 times by a group of men who believed she was stalking them. She wasn't, though. She just happened to have a similar vehicle to the person they thought was a stalker. Now, 4 men are charged in connection to her death, some of them now facing life in prison. This is the case of 17-year-old Kaylee Dutton, who's being remembered as a strong, kind, and determined girl. Her parents say Kaylee loved to ride her dirt bike, something she started doing when she was just 3 years old. Kaylee also graduated high school as a junior last May, just to prove she could. On Friday, January 17th, Kaylee left her family's home looking for something to do. Eventually, she met up with a friend, an 18-year-old whose name has not been released publicly. Together, they ended up at an apartment or townhouse complex in Cedar City, Utah. That's about an hour drive from the Utah-Arizona border. Just before 11 p.m., she was headed home in her red pickup truck with her friend in the passenger seat. But suddenly they noticed something strange. A black truck was tailing them closely. The driver was even flashing their high beams aggressively. Kaylee drove about 6 miles into the rural area of southwest Utah, but she couldn't escape the truck. That's when the black truck pulled up alongside Kaylee's truck, and the man in the passenger seat opened fire. In all, she was shot 12 times. The suspect's truck sped off as Kaylee lost control of her own truck. She swerved off the road and crashed into a vinyl fence. The friend in the passenger seat had an injury to her leg but was able to call 911. The call came into dispatch at 10:32 p.m. First responders arrived on the scene at 10:51. They rushed Kaylee off the scene, but she died on the way to the Cedar City Hospital. The next day, Iron County Sheriff's deputies caught up with the suspects, 3 of which who were trying to leave as they were arrested. Iron County Sheriff's deputies served a search warrant at the home and found several guns with ammo that matched the caliber used in Kaylee's death. They also found a shell casing that had been taken from the suspect's truck. It was set aside in a container like the suspects were trying to throw it away or at least keep it out of sight. Investigators also found narcotics, marijuana vapes, and marijuana pipes inside the home. In all, 4 men were arrested, and here's how the charges break down. Investigators say 23-year-old Michael Edward Hess-Witucky was driving the truck that chased down Kaylee. The man in the passenger seat was 23-year-old Ethan Andrew Galloway. Both of these men face charges of murder, 12 counts of discharge of a firearm resulting in serious injury, obstruction of justice, possession of a controlled substance, and possession of a dangerous weapon by a dangerous person. There are 2 other suspects involved in the case too. That's 21-year-old Aldrich Philippe and 22-year-old Matthew Sorber Petrie. Investigators say Matthew gave Ethan the gun that was used in Kaylee's murder, knowing he planned to use it. Aldrich stayed home, but he knew all of this was happening and didn't do anything to stop it. Both Matthew and Aldrich also apparently knew about the shell casing that was removed from the truck. They now face charges of obstruction of justice, possession of a controlled substance, and being a restricted person in the transaction of a firearm. Michael and Ethan both spoke with investigators after their arrest and explained how this all got started. Before Kaylee's death, they had seen a red pickup truck near their home. They thought the person in the truck, Kaylee, had been stalking them, so they chased her down in order to confront her. In reality, Kaylee had nothing to do with them and just happened to have the same red pickup truck that this alleged stalker drove. Michael and Ethan both admitted to the murder, and at the end of the interview, Ethan wrote an apology note to Kaylee's family. I'm joined now by Sky Lazaro, a Utah criminal defense attorney, and I specifically wanted to talk to you today, Sky, because you are right there in Utah. And when I think of that state, I think it is pretty pro-gun, but things like this don't happen that often, do they?
We don't see shootings such as this as often here in Utah, even though it is a pro-gun or carry state. We do or have seen an increase in gun-related violence and road rage cases, but I think that's a little different than what appears to have happened in this case.
Yeah, that might be a little different, as you said, because in this case, it seems that the suspects thought there was a stalking incident. But even if that was the case, to go from thinking you're following your stalker to then murdering someone, that's a huge escalation, right?
Absolutely, and it's not one that would be justified under some sort of self-defense type justification. In Utah, we're essentially a no duty to retreat or a stand your ground state. but that doesn't mean you get to chase somebody down because they think you're stalking them. That's not reasonable force that would be justified in defending yourself. I mean, this is just to have seen somebody in an apartment complex and then, go get a firearm or have someone give you a firearm and chase them down is uh, extreme and tragic escalation.
I think escalation is a huge word here because to go from 0 to 60 this fast is just wild. And as you pointed out, investigators have said that these men thought that there was someone stalking them who had a red pickup truck. And Kaylee, the victim in this case, also had a red pickup truck, but it was completely unrelated, nothing to do with this alleged stalker. But these two men who hop in a truck and follow her, they don't seem to do their due diligence and make sure it's not the person that they thought it was, right?
No, I mean, based on what's contained in the probable cause statement, which is what we have to go on right now, it looks like they all gave interviews to investigators. Uh, but I don't know that they knew who they were shooting. I think what it sounds like is they pulled up alongside the vehicle and just opened fire. And even if someone in a red pickup truck was stalking them, call the police. I mean, there's other remedies out there now. Given what was recovered in the search warrant, I can understand why these individuals may not want police involvement. But even at that, there are remedies for stalking, and one of them is not chasing down the person you think is stalking you. And stalking is an interesting word because when we think of stalking, it usually comes in the context of you're fearful, right? That someone is going to do harm to you, or is surveilling you and it's causing you some sort of emotional distress. People who are being stalked don't generally, they call the police. They don't go take matters into their own hands and open fire and fire 12 rounds into a truck without identifying the driver.
You talked about the search warrant, and I think you're referencing the fact that when it was executed, some drug paraphernalia, marijuana was found at their home. So that part does make sense. But multiple times you said open fire. And it just gets me thinking. I mean, we have this 17-year-old girl who maybe has had her license for 1 year at this point. I mean, she's just a kid. And I think back to getting my own license at the time, and my parents would tell me, be extra careful if someone's following you, all of those things. So it's basically her worst nightmare. And then the fact that we have the person in the passenger seat opens fire, as you said, and he shoots her 12 times. So it's not just once, it's 12. He just kept going. I mean, that's a huge number, right?
It is 12 rounds is a lot. It's not I fired a warning shot at the vehicle or and not that that would be excusable, right? But to fire 12 rounds and not stop is, I mean, we don't you don't typically see that unless somebody is purposely trying to kill someone.
Right, 12 shots does sound like unsurvivable. And that unfortunately was the case here. She did succumb to her injuries. So if we put that part aside, eventually these two did come forward when they were arrested, and they admitted to it. They fessed up. The driver and the passenger said, yes, we did do this. Additionally, the person who's the passenger that fired all these shots wrote a letter of apology to Kaylee's family. Can that be used in court almost as a confession?
Yes, anything that a defendant says can be used in court against them unless there's a Miranda issue or some sort of constitutional violation issue that would make it suppressible. But so long as the investigators did their job correctly, Mirandized them correctly and conducted those interviews, those statements of the defendant will absolutely uh, have evidentiary value at trial, as will likely the letter. There's maybe some arguments surrounding the letter, um, that they could potentially keep it out in a trial setting. We're a long ways from that. Obviously, there's probably going to be, if there's not some sort of resolution reached in this case based on their statements and it ends up in trial, I could see some litigation surrounding the letter. But there certainly is a potential that that letter would come in as evidence.
And we do sometimes see defendants recant after they've confessed. So let's just pretend, speculate that that's what these two defendants do and kind of take it back. Is that going to be hard for them to combat because the prosecution potentially has this letter, as you said, but they also have the spoken confessions to the authorities?
Right. So let's um, say that they admitted to it because the police coerced them or whatever. That may be grounds to get it suppressed altogether. They may come back and change their story. So now you've got inconsistent statements. And where you have inconsistent statements, that just um, gives stronger grounds for admissibility of that letter uh, to show, that they really, when they admitted, that's what they were doing versus coming up with a new story later on and having inconsistent statements.
Let's go back and talk about the first degree murder charge now that Ethan faces. This is the person who actually fired the gun in this case. You talked a bit about the charges that he faces, one for each bullet that was fired, the 12. What do you make of the charges altogether?
uh, I think based on what's contained in the probable cause statement and kind of what's been reported with regard to the witness statements, I think these are pretty consistent with what is probably proper to charge in this type of case. It seems that based on some of the witness statements and the admissions, at least that they've given thus far, that they intended to go chase her down and use the weapon. And murder has a mens rea of purposely, knowingly, intentionally, and by taking the act of getting the gun, chasing her down, and then firing into the vehicle, I think that probably fits, at least for charging purposes, right? To be able to charge them with murder. Not surprised by the felony discharge of a firearm for each discharge, or the obstruction, quite frankly, because it sounds like they uh, removed some casings and did some things like that. I don't have a criminal history report on any of these individuals. I'm assuming that the reason they are a restricted person is because there were drugs found when they searched the scene. And so there was a firearm and drugs in the same vicinity, which in Utah makes you a restricted person for purposes of possessing a firearm. And then we have of course, the misdemeanor charges for the drugs.
So, one of the reasons I specifically wanted to talk to you is because you are in Utah, and that is a death penalty state. So, what would that look like for prosecutors to determine whether they're going to make this a death penalty case or not?
They certainly probably can. They're charged with murder, not aggravated murder. Um, so I don't know if those conversations have been held. Within the office, they don't have to make that decision until after the preliminary hearing. So they've got, I believe, 60 days after the preliminary hearing with which to either they have to file a notice with the court where they're seeking the death penalty or a declination. Usually, if they're going to go down that route, and they could amend and file an amended information, but we usually see it charged as an aggravated murder versus just murder.
So we probably don't expect to see death penalty in this case, but it's still possible. I guess we'll keep an eye when it comes to the prelim. I wanted to talk about the other two people who are charged in this case as well. They are facing obstruction charges.
Mhm.
Can you explain this a bit to me? Because they weren't in the vehicle, they didn't pull the trigger, but one of the people did allegedly provide the weapon. Is that right?
That's my understanding is the one individual who wasn't there provided the weapon, based on what he told the investigators. Obstruction in Utah is essentially exactly what it sounds like either um, lying to police officers, concealing evidence after a crime or cleaning up after a crime, having full knowledge of what happened, and doing it with the intent to frustrate an investigation. So I think I read in the probable cause statements that there were, um, they'd removed
The shell casing,
the
right? I
shell
think they were.
casing, yeah, from the vehicle, because that would, the shell casings could be linked, to the crime. So anytime you take in knowing once you know what happened or you were part of the planning in it, and then you do something after the fact to either remove evidence, keep somebody from testifying, or give false information to investigators, that can be the basis for an obstruction charge. A lot of times they use obstruction if they can charge it against people who might have been involved in order to get testimony from them. So, down the road they may say, look, we'll give you a deal, but if this case goes to trial, we're going to need you to testify. That may or may not be important in this case, given statements that were made.
We have seen that in other cases we've covered here on Law and Crime, where some of the people who were involved then flip and provide some really key witness testimony if it goes to jury trial. And that's going to be the question I'm going to end on today, Sky. Do you think this would go to jury trial or end in a plea deal for the 2 murder charges?
I mean, obviously, it's really early. They're set for, they just had an initial appearance, and without having seen discovery or seeing what happens within the litigation of this case, given, what's out there, they're probably likely to plead this case out in some level. Like, maybe they make them plead to the murder and they dismiss these other counts, or something along those lines. It's hard to say, where this case ends up, but where, they've already admitted to it, written this apology letter, you don't have a great defense. Now, that being said, if the prosecutors just say, hey, look, we're not giving a deal, like, we're not, um, sometimes you go to trial just to beat some of these other charges, beat some of the charges, or whatever it is. So, but I would say it's probably not likely.
Still early on, so I guess we'll see where this case is headed. Overall, just a heartbreaking one. Sky Lazaro, thanks for coming on and giving us your take.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
After their arrests on January 18th, all 4 suspects were booked into the Iron County Jail. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.